So I'm going to go ahead and get started introducing this session because we have some great presentations, but we have limited time and we want to make sure we have time for everyone. So I just want to double check, is Carrie Schewel, did she sign in via Zoom? Is she online? We might.
Hi, everyone. I'm here.
Oh, great. You just turned on your camera and you're visible now, so that's wonderful. Carrie's going to be presenting first, actually. Did you download her presentation or is she you're going to screen share, I guess. Is that right, Carrie?
Yes, I'll screen share.
Great. Sorry, it's not showing up there. All right, so we're doing.
Can I go ahead and share now?
Yeah. Yep, you can go ahead. But I want to go through first and just talk about, you can go ahead and get your slides up, Carrie, no problem. But I want to just mention on the app, one of the presentations was missing. That's Fabien Cotier, my colleague here. And he'll be presenting as well. So that means we have 4 wonderful presentations. We're going to keep people to 15 minutes, including myself. After Carrie, we'll have Filiz Garip presenting on asymmetry of climate-induced migration decisions, departure and return. Then we'll have myself and David Wrathall, who's online, presenting about international migration from Central America and West Africa. And finally, Fabien Cotier will be talking about climate shocks, displacement, and organized crime in Central America. Which is a topic that we're all actually been working with David with as well. So with that, I think I'll just pass things to Carrie so she can get us off started with beyond push factor narratives, development, climate change, and the social production of migration, aspirations, and capabilities in rural Ethiopia. Over to you, Kerilyn.
Great. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we see you. And I'll try to keep time. You might hear my voice at a certain point and I'll say, 1 minute or something.
Okay, sounds great. I'm very happy to be here. Very grateful we can join virtually. Wish I could be with you all in person. It's looks like a wonderful conference. I'll jump right in. What I'm going to focus on today is a case study research from a village called Waiso in Ethiopia. And a lot of what I've been thinking about lately is, how can we effectively move beyond push factor narratives? And what I mean by that is how do we move beyond seeing sort of a climate hazard or climate impacts as these push factors that uproot people? What's an alternative sort of theoretical or conceptual approach that would allow us to, as I think Alex put in his session description, better understand the indirect effects of climate impacts on different mobility and immobility outcomes? So why challenge push factor narratives? Why are they inadequate? Well, one important reason is that they kind of perpetuate mobility bias in migration research. So it gives an overemphasis to the drivers of migration and neglects the factors that might resist movement or restrict movement. And when we pay more attention to those factors, we start to see many different ways of staying put. And immobility is one of the puzzles. I think any researcher who's looking at climate migration quickly realizes that often less people are moving than we would expect them to. The framework that you see on the right is the aspiration capability framework, which I found helpful in that it distinguishes between the aspiration to move and the capability to do so. In order to move, you need both of these things, but some people might desire to move and lack the capability and be involuntarily immobile, while others might not have a desire to leave, regardless of whether they would or wouldn't be able to move. So the theoretical approach that I've been playing with for the last few years is really mobility transition theory. And this is an older theory that sort of thinks about the relationship between migration and development, not just economic development, not just human development, but really more and more researchers are talking about social transformation, these sort of big, deep changes to society that occur and that we tend to talk about in terms of development. And the reason I think this is so important is because it's actually in many so-called developing country contexts that we see some of the greatest vulnerability to climate change, but these are also the exact same contexts in which development is reshaping migration systems. And so understanding how climate impacts intersect with these developmental drivers of migration is really important. So the basic insight of mobility transition theory is that economic growth, expanding education, infrastructure, changing culture, ideas about the good life, all of these are reshaping people's aspirations and their capabilities to move. On the right side is a chart from Ethiopia, which is just showing migrant stock data since 1960, and the darker shades show huge international movements under the Marxist Derg regime, when most people were asylum seekers or refugees. But from the 1990s onwards, that picture changed, and we started to see a lot more international migration for other reasons. Ethiopia is a very interesting case for studying the relationship between migration and development. Anyone familiar with the country is likely thinking about the more recent Tigray War from 2020 onwards, and of course, massive displacement that was associated with that conflict. But there are also very deep-seated shifts in how Ethiopians are moving both within the country and internationally. And in one paper with the geographer Asma Malagaspa here, we tried to map how the whole kind of migration system in Ethiopia was changing since 1960. And we noticed three core trends. One is that there's a decline in more traditional mobility systems. So by that, I mean nomadic or semi-nomadic movements, seasonal agricultural movements. There's been an urbanization of internal migration. So Ethiopians have always been very mobile, but historically this has been rural movements. And it was in the 2010s where that changed. And now rural urban migration is the most common internal migration trajectory. And then we've seen a diversification of international migration. And what I want to focus on here, and a big driver of this diversification, is the rise of international labor migration. And a lot of that is directed towards the Middle East. As you can see in the map to the left, there's really three main migration routes of international migrants from Ethiopia southward down through Kenya, Tanzania, onto South Africa, kind of west through Sudan and onto Europe, and then to the Middle East. And this is these are very young migrants. A recent survey, we have very bad migration data, like in many places all over the world. But what data we do have suggests that these international migrants are very young. 78% in a recent survey were between the ages of 15 and 29. And 31% of those were moving to Saudi Arabia alone. So the Middle Eastern migration trajectory is a big one. Now, these migration trajectories are also very gendered. So we have predominantly men moving southwards, and we have a lot of women who are moving to the Middle East to meet the demand for domestic workers in those countries. So the WAISO case study, the reason why I think it's important is it's an interesting case to really think about how we might integrate mobility transition theory with an analysis of climate impacts. And what I'm going to focus on here are the findings around immobility impacts of a severe drought that hit WAISO in 2015, 2016. And I want to show how the different aspiration and capability categories, mobility, involuntary mobility, even voluntary mobility, that we might benefit a lot from not seeing these as outcomes that resulted from the drought, but as kind of pre-existing outcomes that are related to different developmental drivers, and then understand how a drought reshapes the experiences of those mobility and immobility outcomes. That was not super clear, but in essence, I'll argue that involuntary immobility really deepened through the drought, but that I also saw continued migration, which was not actually in relationship to the drought, but for people who were pursuing education, salaried work, or international labor migration, and were able to draw on their migrant networks to move during the period of the drought. So this is based on household survey data, in-depth interviews, primarily collected between 2016 and 2018. But I also draw on more ethnographic methods and archival research. And really, my goal is not to make a claim about all of rural Ethiopia. and the drivers of international migration there, but really to contribute to more theoretical generalization, to better understand the social world that, in particular, women are choosing to leave when they move as domestic workers. Now, most of the people who are leaving WAISO, from the household survey data, most people are moving very short distances from the village to the neighboring towns. You also see some longer distance movements to larger cities in Ethiopia, and a small but significant share who are moving to the Middle East. To put some of the findings from my qualitative research up front, one thing that was very striking, I kind of came in expecting, based on previous research or headlines I'd read about this movement, I was expecting to hear kind of horrific stories of trafficking and exploitation. And I was surprised by how rational women were in making this decision to leave, and often how young they were. But this was really related to changing ideas about what a good life is, and these deep aspirations for change, a discontent with rural futures or early marriage, and a real desire to have an urban future. And so one way of describing this is that aspirations have expanded faster than the capabilities to realize them in Ethiopia. And for women, there's this distinct opportunity to move to the Middle East because there are these brokers and agencies who are facilitating that movement. And just within the period of a decade or two, labor migration has really become an alternative to marriage for a particular subset of young women. I won't dwell on this too much, but I just want to highlight the importance of formal education in this process, not just in reshaping young people's ideas about what they can achieve with their life, but also just structurally, we can see that on the left-hand side, anyone who has secondary education or higher no longer lives in the village, lives in town. With women, it's a similar trend. A lot more women have no education at all and mostly live in rural areas. And in the yellow box there, you can see the women who are moving to the Middle East. So these are not women who have the highest levels of education or come from the most privileged families, but they're also not with the lowest levels of education or the poorest families. So they're sort of in this with middling levels of education and usually middling levels of resources. This was an important part of, I apologize for speaking so fast. I realize I've put too much on here for 15 minutes, but this movement was really an important part of the transition to adulthood for young women. And if they couldn't continue with their education, if they failed the exams after grade 8 or grade 10, it was now there were two options. You marry someone or you fly outside to the Arab countries. These are beautiful quotes, but I'll skip them for the sake of time. Now, most of the women who are leaving, why are they leaving? They're leaving to move to town. A good life is only really possible if you actually already have money in your hand. And most households from WAISO, this village, are subsistence farmers, unpredictable annual harvests. So they often don't have money in their hand, nor do they have the promise of a good income from local work if they just decided to move to town. So really, for young women who moved abroad, the goal was to earn enough money to then be able to come back to town, build a house or rent a house, start a small business, and it was really a way of making a rural urban move. Now, domestic workers in Beirut, which was the primary destination from WAISO, earned about $150 per month. They made an investment up front, but then that investment could be paid back from their salaries in the first few months. So this was a very different earning situation from just a rural urban move without the promise of good work. So it's kind of the opposite of the stepwise migration that migration researchers might be more familiar with. This was really this, irony of globalization, that it's easier to move to the Saudi Arabia than it is to actually move, 15 kilometers to the nearest town. Most of the women would use this as an investment in a house for their family and paying for the weddings of their siblings. This was a house in WAISO where the family very proudly put, the woman's name who had built this for them. They'd open their own shops or coffee houses. And also through their movement, signaled changes in sort of lifestyle and fashion. That kind of signaled that they were moving into sort of more modern lives, if you will, compared to other rural women. Now, a lot of women wanted to move but couldn't. I'm happy to answer more questions about that in the Q&A. And the other thing I want to highlight is that many young men didn't have the same opportunity, and involuntary immobility was extremely widespread within WISO and remained the kind of most common mobility outcome. Many young people and older people wanted to move to town but didn't have the resources to do so. So what happens in this context when a drought strikes? This was a priority zone for the Ethiopian government. It was the worst drought since 1987. And I'm also going to skip this part for the sake of time, as I know I'm approaching my time. But there are some immobility outcomes that I want to highlight. So in the short term, really what drought did is it constrained migration capabilities, particularly for households who are reliant on farming livelihoods. So this meant that for many, migration plans were paused. Maybe I'll be able to migrate after next year's harvest. There was also a heightened reliance on remittances in the village and a deepening of this experience of involuntary immobility, and a risk that some of those who are involuntarily immobile might even become what we call displaced in place. However, migration didn't stop altogether. And I was also struck, just as I was struck by this kind of deepening involuntary immobility and precariousness associated with the drought, I was also struck by some people that just kept moving. And this was often those who had more diversified income sources. They had other businesses they could draw on, networks with salaried work, or migrant ties that were able to facilitate their continued movement. And importantly, their decisions to move were shaped by other goals: education, modern work, urban life, access to capital, not really related to fleeing the climate impacts. So the main point I really want to hit home is that those who left WISO after the drought were actually the least affected by the drought. And the most direct and kind of devastating effects were on those who did not move. And this does raise a question about, in the long term, recurrent drought could threaten to widen the inequalities between the poorest and the wealthiest households. And much of that inequality stems from access to migration and migrant networks. I have a comment on trapped populations, but I think I'll just jump to the key takeaways, which is that I think we should be cautious about characterizing migration from climate-stressed contexts as climate migration. In WISO, again, it was those who moved after the drought who were the least affected by it, and that the drought constrained mobility by reducing migration capabilities and deepening involuntary mobility, especially among the poorest. Now, distinguishing between the aspiration and capability to move in research may help us be able to identify who feels involuntarily immobile today, and thus who might be the most vulnerable when a particular climate hazard strikes. At a more theoretical level, climate impacts act through existing migration systems. They don't operate in isolation, and that paying attention to the ways in which different developmental drivers are changing aspirations and capabilities in many low-income countries can help us understand how people are already moving, and then inform our reading of how people will or will not move in response to climate impacts. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the other presentations. And a last plug for, if you'd like a deeper dive into WISO, I have a book coming out in September digitally. So please take note, and I'll share, I suppose, on LinkedIn once that is out. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Carrie. We've got about 25 people in the room or more, so it's a nice group. Filiz, do you want to come on up, and we'll get you set up, screen share. Just so people are aware, we will do some Q&A and discussion, but maybe hold your questions for now, and then we'll get everybody lined up.
Okay. Shall I go? Sure. Thank you, Alex, for organizing this. It's really a great group of people that I admire a lot. I don't think I've met David in person, but hello. And then it's great to be presenting with Fabienne and Kerilyn. Long time no see. I really like your theoretical framework, and it's been so generative for climate migration. And I'm sad to say that I'm not going to use it today, but I think about it all the time. So this work is actually joined with Elan Van Vinist, Simone Capisani, Sarah Constantino. So I'm presenting on behalf of all of us. And what we're trying to understand is the Mexico-US migration context, and something Kerry said, that climate migration is going to happen on existing tracks. So this is an idea that we also subscribe to here, and we're trying to understand the sensitivity of this migration flow to climate shocks. Okay, so this research on weather shocks and migration has been expanding in multiple directions. So we know a lot of things already. We know that weather shocks in origin sending places are related to both internal and international migration. But then, as kind of research accumulates, we also see a lot of mixed results and a lot of variation across settings and population groups. So one of our goals here is to identify the sources of this variation. And what we think we need to know is basically seeing migration more as a process. So a lot of the work that we see is about how when a shock is experienced, whether people depart from a place. But departure is actually only the first step in migration. And when a migrant moves to a place, as Kerilyn also talked about, that person has to make the same decision over and over again. Are they going to stay in place? Are they going to move elsewhere? Are they going to come back? So we think that if we see migration and return as connected decisions, we'll be able to better understand the climate migration linkages. So we want to see first how weather shocks matter to both migration and return decisions. And we want to understand if the effects are symmetric in the sense that if I experience a shock here, what I do is the same as if I were to experience a shock back in Turkey, let's say, where I'm originally from. And then we want to understand if these shocks work differently for different groups in the population. Is there heterogeneity that pooled models will be masking? Okay, the case that we're going to look at is the largest sustained international flow in the world, the movement of people between Mexico and the United States. So the solid line here is showing the number of Mexican-born people in the United States. So you can see that in the 1960s, there were less than 500,000 people. And by 2010, the number had reached over 12 million. So the period that we're studying covers from 1990 to 2018. Again, this is a period of mass mobility where over 6 million people entered the country, many of them multiple times. The data set that we use for migration comes from the Mexican Migration Project. So this is a repeated cross-sectional design that started in the 1980s. And each year, researchers go to a select few communities in Mexico, and they canvass the entire community, and they randomly select 200 households. And then for each of these households, everyone living or kind of who's away from that household temporarily, they collected retrospective life history information. So we can basically recreate the experiences of these people going back. And the time period that we're relying on here covers from 1991 to 2018. And we cover about 157 communities in Mexico that are kind of regionally diverse. We have information on characteristics and life choices of people. For about 100,000 individuals in total, about 8,000 have migrated to the US at least once. Because we have this person year information, this gives us about 1 million observations, person year observations to work with that are spread across this time period. Now we're interested in basically gradual changes in weather, like changes in temperature and changes in precipitation. And for that, we obtained the DayMet data. This is gridded data that is collected by a NASA service, DayMet, and it's the finest resolution that we can find. It covers every kilometer square grid in North America, and it records daily precipitation and temperature values. So this data becomes available after 1980 onwards. So we use these data to basically overlay the grids onto our communities, and then we create kind of aggregate measures of precipitation and temperature. For their destinations in the United States, we rely on MSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area level observations. And just for information, the communities in Mexico are smaller than municipalities, which are nested in states. So many of them are quite small. Some of them are from urban places. And the way they isolated the community was basically by neighborhood. Okay, so this is just kind of one picture from our data, just to show kind of the complexity and the patterning of migration flows. So here we see where migrants come from in Mexico, where they cross the border, and where they end up in the United States. So you can see that it's not exactly a straight line. Most people are trying to go to border crossing locations that are easier to cross, or many people from their communities have used that location. And again, for information, about 85% of people in this data are undocumented migrants. So they're really kind of hard to capture with other data sources. So what we're interested in this project is first, whether people migrate, so they leave the community, and then where they end up in the United States, and then whether they return back within the time frame. So we're not really looking at where they're crossed from, but then we can kind of include that later on. Okay, so some patterns. There is basically 5 US states that capture over 70% of the trips in our data. So California is the biggest. About 40% of migrants, over 40% of migrants end up in California. And then Texas and Illinois are the next two. About 10% of migrants each go there. And then New York and Florida are about kind of 4 or 5%. And then the remaining states kind of absorb about 30% of migrants. So the way kind of we look at it is our main outcome of interest is whether someone departs Mexico, and then once they have departed and they're in the US, whether they're going to return back. So to understand this outcome, we fit a linear probability of migration and return. So the model is actually kind of simple. So we look at whether someone is going to take a first US trip in a given year T. And then our main indicators of interest is if their community has experienced any kind of fluctuation in precipitation and temperature in the previous year. We have several controls that we know matter, like age, education, and household wealth and community characteristics. And then importantly here, because migration is such a complex phenomenon, US policy matters, a lot of other things matter. We include regional and temporal fixed effects. So in our models, we have fixed effects for Mexican states and also fixed effects for years. So these basically absorb kind of things we can observe and things we cannot observe. And then this means that the weather impacts are captured if communities in the same state, if there are communities in the same state that experience and do not experience these events. So it's kind of a quite rigid specification. And our sample includes all individuals in these communities starting at age 15 onwards. When it comes to return, our sample gets smaller. So recall we have about 100,000 individuals, 8,000 have migrated. So now our sample has become these 8,000 people, they're in the US, and we're doing the same model. We're looking at, are they gonna go back to Mexico? And will this depend on any kind of precipitation and temperature deviation in their current place in the United States? And this time we also include fixed effects for US state indicators because some states are kind of more rigid in how they impose immigration law. Okay, so to understand, to measure these weather deviations, we set aside a decade as our normal period. Basically, we don't want to compare normally hot places to normally cool places. We want to compare each community to its own past and to see if they have experienced something out of their own distribution or kind of at the tail ends of their distribution. So basically, what we do is, if this is our normal period, 1980 to 1990, in every subsequent year, we look at how different the weather condition was compared to that mean in the baseline period divided by the standard deviation. And then we create these indicators. Very wet means the community received more than 2 standard deviations higher rain than its average in its baseline. Wet means it's between 1 and 2 standard deviations, and normal is between -1 and 1. And we do this for both temperature and weather. Okay, so let's kind of look at the main effects first. So here I'm showing you what we observe when we look at the outcome of taking a first trip. We see that when it's very dry, these are kind of drought conditions, there is more migration. So the orange means kind of positive here. But then when it's hot, we see kind of a declined migration, a negative correlation there. When we look at return, the same condition drought now has a negative effect. So in the US, if people experience drought here, it means they are delaying their return back home. Now, this is a very typical example of like, here is the same shock and people are responding differently, and now we need to make sense of it. So our main goal here is that, is there a better way of identifying the heterogeneity here? And we think this heterogeneity in part lies with kind of population level heterogeneity. Not everyone in the population will respond in the same way. And we want to be able to kind of discover the sources of that. To do that, remember we have indicators like age, sex, education, household wealth, community characteristics. We try all possible interactions between weather and other individuals. So when you kind of fit models like that, you always run the risk of identifying some idiosyncrasy in your data that is not really kind of the signal, it is the noise, because you're overfitting the data when your model gets too complicated. So we want to prevent that. To do that, we actually use cross-validation, and we do some kind of out-of-sample testing to identify the most predictive interactions there. So the way it works is we use a 10-fold cross-validation. So basically, we divide our data into 10 parts. We set aside 1 part for evaluation, performance evaluation, and on the remaining 9 folds, we fit 1 set of models with kind of given set of interactions. And then we look at the predictive performance of that model on kind of the out-of-sample 10th fold. So you do this multiple times, you cycle through the data, picking a different splitting of the data each time, and then you average over. So this way, you kind of minimize the risk of overfitting the data, and you're identifying the signals better. Okay, so these are some results from there. So just for reference, on the y-axis, we see the out-of-sample R-squared of a given model. And then on the x-axis are kind of a selection of models that we've tried, a subset of the many more there. So if you look at the first kind of thing on the x-axis, when we just include Mexican weather indicators, our out-of-sample performance is about 8.5% or 8.43%. Now, what happens when we introduce these interactions? Some of these interactions perform significantly better than this main effect model. And 3 stand out here. One is age interactions. This means that people of different age groups are responding differently to weather shocks in Mexico. The next one is education. And the final one is US, when we include main effects for US states, like the top 5 US states that receive migrants. So all of these things matter. Now that we've obtained this information with this cross-validation, we can go and fit a simpler model and then just consider the things that we know mattered, not all possible interactions. So when we do that, we find actually quite different effects for age groups, as expected. We see that when it's very dry in Mexico, it's actually the youngest who are mobilized. When we look at the older groups, they are less likely to move. So basically, the small positive effect that we find in the main model is an averaging out of these things. When we look at very hot weather, again, it's like these opposing effects. Now the younger people are less likely to move, and then older people are more likely to do so. And if you remember in the main effects model, this was an actually average negative effect. So basically, by looking at this heterogeneity, I think we can better understand some of the mechanisms that are producing it. Education, similar effects to age. Dry weather increases the migration of least educated people, again, youngest and least educated. And then hot weather is actually decreasing the migration of people with that kind of education. So when we look at extreme weather in top US destinations, surprisingly, we find that it has a positive effect on moving. So this is telling us that as people are escaping these extreme conditions, they end up in places that also experience extreme conditions. Now, what about return? When we do the same thing, like trying different interactions, the results actually are quite different. We don't see an age gradient. We don't see an education gradient. The gradients that we see are by occupation, what kind of occupations migrants are working in the US, and the time that they have already been. So people respond differently depending on these kind of characteristics. And when we kind of dig deeper, we see that when it's very dry here, agricultural workers delay their return. When it's very hot, manufacturing workers, this includes mostly construction workers, delay their return. The mechanism we have in mind here is basically not being able to reach your target earnings. If you're unable to work because of drought or extreme heat, then that delays your return. But then it's kind of different from what we found out in the migration case. So basically, one thing that we want to take away is the asymmetry between, the impact of weather depending on where you are. So the same thing that encourages you to move in Mexico is actually discouraging you to move when you're in the US. So the effects are not symmetric. And then the weather impacts vary across groups. And again, here, to identify this variation, we use a data-driven approach. So we did kind of cross-validations, and we tried to use out-of-sample performance as a metric to pick these things. And some of the results are actually meaningful, especially when it comes to return, and it varies by occupation, makes a lot of sense to us. When it comes to departure and variation by age and education, again, we're thinking about these things and trying to understand the mechanisms. We're also considering more complex interactions. In other words, does it matter whether you're in rural or urban places, and so on and so forth? And yeah, I'll stop here. So thank you very much.
Maybe since the next two papers are part of the same project, we will stop here for a moment and just entertain any questions that people may have for the presenters who just presented. If there are any in the room or online, I can't read the Q&A down here. Let's see if there's. Can't see the presentation. Okay, hopefully that's corrected now. Any questions for the first two presenters? Otherwise, I think we'll go ahead, but we'll have time to have hopefully some discussion after my presentation. So if you want to bring up.
Hello, everybody. May I have a question, please? Hello, can I have a question?
Can you hear me? Yes, you may.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. I have a technical question. So we didn't have opportunity to see the presentation of Filiz, so it was not shared within the online. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Robert Stoyanov, Mendel University, Czech Republic. So it was so interesting, but we didn't. Now we can see that.
Sorry.
Yeah, so we're working on that. Sorry, Robert. And I apologize.
No problem. Yeah. We can speak with Filiz online way. Thank you so much.
My presentation. Does this have you can maybe go ahead with Fabian's, and I'll put mine on the flash drive. Does this have an ability to transfer to a flash drive?
So you can also.
It's on. I did load it this morning. So what happened? But Fabian, why don't you come on up and we'll get mine ready. Sharing, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fabien Gauthier. I'm an associate research scientist at Sherbinin, where my research looked at the cause of migration, especially climate change, but also the consequence for political violence. I'll be presenting today a paper that is ongoing. We're about to finish. It's due end of next week for a special issue in PNAS, so we're a little bit under pressure. But you'll have the results in primer. And this paper is titled Immobility in the Face of Crisis, Violence and Organized Crime Decrease Climate-Induced Migration from Central America. And I should say, actually, we look specifically at Honduras and Guatemala. That says a joint work with a number of co-authors, primarily Alexei, of course, Jennifer Devine, David Wellbeing from Oregon State, who is present online, as well as numerous other colleagues, Alice Aranello Thompson, Rebecca Justin here also in the room, Lea Manak, Nick Maglioka, Jennifer Nakamura, Eric Nielsen, and so it's part of this Minerva Research Initiative project that looks at the driver of migration in Central America and West Africa. Alex will let you know more about this project, which unfortunately was canceled as many others. We had multiple components, and I will be talking about specifically that component, looking at the interplay between violence, narco-trafficking organization, and migration. So a little bit about the motivation. So there has been, obviously, as you all are aware here, there's been a rising number of irregular migrants upon the US southwestern border since the early 2000s and originating from Central America. In a new development, a very marked increase, and I'll show you some numbers afterwards. And not only this, we have a changing composition of those flows. And so increasingly, we have unaccompanied minors that are part of these flows. And that raises a question about driving a little bit this change in compositions and the presence of those young unaccompanied minors. Not only this, and I think that's very important in that context, we have a context that is marked by several climate impact, either drought, hot weather, but also extreme events, hurricanes, floodings, but also, and that's been a little bit, I would argue, left aside in most of the literature on climate migration, significant violence, very high level of homicides, and sustained presence of organized crime organization in these two countries. And most of the literature in this field has been generally looking at the direct impact of climate and migration. And when looking at heterogeneities, mostly looking at profiles of those migrants. But the context in which migration happens and violence in political orders really matter too. And I think it's important to also look at this context and trying to look at the interplay between these factors. And just to anticipate a little bit, so you'll see about what we are going to. So our main finding is basically that the climate driver themselves have marginal impact on migrations. If anything, it seems that there's significant heterogeneity between Honduras and Guatemala in the migration response to those climate impact, and that violence and narco-trafficking activities, and that I think is a key aspect, have actually a suppressing effect on migration. So I'm not talking here about the direct effect of violence, right? People flee violence. That's a well-established factors, and not teaching you anything here, but that within a context where you have a significant amount of violence, those climate effects on migration are being suppressed further. So the research question we have is to what extent does the presence of organized crime and violence amplify or suppress the link between climate viability and out-migration in Central America? And so to do so, we used data that's been kindly shared with us by David LeBlanc from a FOI request he had submitted on apprehension of migrants at the US southwestern borders in 2009. And the data itself actually covered the entire domain of apprehensions. We only here look at Guatemala and Honduras because these are the countries for which we have homicide, but most importantly, data on organized crime activities at the very fine grained level. And so we actually conduct analysis at the municipal level, which is admin 2, so it's a bit lower level of aggregation, the data that Filiz just talked about earlier. And yeah, we also use econometric models. So what are we talking about? And so here, I'll show you basically like a set of figures. So on the panel R on the top left, you see very well these trends at the monthly level since 2010, when we started to have the data available on border apprehensions. In green, it's for Guatemala, and orange for Honduras. And you see that's very marked increase. This is a log scale on the y-axis. So small change, actually large magnitude in changes. And from about 2010 to the peak in 2019, we have a 20-fold increase in the monthly rate of migration. That's a huge increase. Part of it is we can see a bit the effect of policy change. For instance, the election of Trump in his first administration in 2017 led to a marked drop. The same with the women in Mexico, policy with a lag. The other very interesting dynamics there is what you see in panel B is this change in the ratio of unaccompanied minor versus total flow. And you see here, beginning in mid-2012, there's a marked increase in the share of unaccompanied minor from about 10%, and then just in a matter of year jump to about 30%. And when you multiply this by this massive increase, the numbers are really large. What we're talking about. The gray line, just for you, those of you interested, actually in Mexico as a waypoint comparison, just to like really highlight how these countries really are contrasting with what we see in the border region. I would say that you'll see the same picture if you have El Salvador. We don't show it here because we don't have data on narco trafficking organization for this country, but it's the same dynamic. On the panel C on the top right, you see here the homicide rates for these countries. On the left, this is the bar chart you see. I'll talk about the segment line afterwards. So, and I mean, both countries have very high level of homicide violence, topping about 0.4 for Guatemala per 1,000 inhabitants. It's about 100 times more than New York City, and double that for Honduras. The trend, though, it's interesting. The trend is actually decreasing over the period. It peaks in Honduras in 2013, but then it decreases, a steady decrease in violence. But and I think why things get really interesting is that the decrease in violence doesn't necessarily correlate with narco trafficking organizations. What you see on the segment plot at the very top of panel C is that the share of municipio that record high level of drug trafficking and other organized crime organization presence. So we have a pedigree score of 0 to 4, 4 being high certainty, 0 being low certainty, and number actually let's fluctuate across the period, but there's no marked decrease, and that shows something that violence, although it's a byproduct of byproduct activity of those organizations, violence itself has not a clear linkage with the presence and activities of those groups. This group are involved in drug trafficking, human trafficking. They use a lot of coercions, but high level of violence might be more indicative of the war on drugs, also war with the local authorities, but also violence between organized crime groups and so on. And on the bottom, on the panel D at the bottom right, there you see the trends in with the bar chart, with the precipitation and the trends with for the top of the segment chart. We see this that decline in precipitation in both countries over the period with compared to fluctuating cloud. So that's a bit about for the context. But I think it underscores why we should be taking this issue around violence and narco trafficking organization seriously in studying those effects of climate on migration in these countries. And so what we did, we have this database of about 6.2 million records, of which going back from FY 2010, so it started in October 2009, and all the way to 2022. It's all Title 8 apprehension. So after 2020, it gets really messy, and we should not use it because of the pandemic and Title 42. But it provides information on date of apprehension. So it's daily, actually, the age, the citizenship, self-reported, of course, and the municipality, state, and country of birth. And as well as information about whether someone is an accompanied minor, part of a family unit after 2012, or a single adult. What we did was to geocode this data for Central America specifically. So we leave the rest outside, and that requires to make the assumption that, of course, if we use this as a proxy for migration, that the place of origin was the place of departure. I think it's a bit of a heroic assumption, but there are reasons to believe that at best it's probably quasi-random. And what we have from some data from census is that, by and large, people, especially in rural municipalities, stay within this municipality, so that we think some people certainly might have moved between the place of birth and the time of departure, but we think probably a relatively large share actually left from the place of birth. And so we were able to geocode 40,000 unique geolocations because, of course, many migrants come from the same place, so we have much less unique place of origin than migrants, and which account about 71% of the data set that is geocoded at the municipal level. And if you look at admin 1, so the department is about 90%. In fact, it's actually even higher because that includes also the number for 2022, where there's a huge drop in the accuracy of in the comprehensiveness of the data. So we're looking more at 80% actually. And yeah, we have a geocoder. I won't go too much in detail for the sake of time here, but we try complex algorithm that first try to find this place of birth, state of birth, and then if we don't find it, then try to use a county query instead, using the city as a county, identify an OpenStreetMap, and then trying to invert like sounds that are confusing between English and Spanish, etc. Right, and so that's a map just to show you. This is summing across all 10 years of data we have for our analysis up to 2019. That shows you the distribution of the place of origin of migrant. Again, we assume that the place of birth is the place of departure. We see some interesting patterns, of course. This is on a log scale. So again, small changes in color means small large differences. We see very well major urban areas on this map. So like Tegucigalpa, San Pedro Sula, Huehuetenango, but and Guatemala City are a clear hotspot, but we see also some interesting patterns, right? So more, for instance, Honduras, more migration along the Caribbean coast, less on the south eastern side of the country, etc. So I won't go again for the sake of time too much in detail, but that's just to show you a little bit how rich is this data in terms of like identifying the place of origin. And so our research design used this again, the municipio /year setup. It's about, we have 10 years of data in about 650 municipalities between both countries. The different variable is the log number of apprehension in a year. So we actually aggregate the data to the year level, annual level. We use other different variable like the migration rates and the change in migration. Doesn't seems to matter that much, I should say. But we also try different model. The predictor, so for climate variability, our main predictor is terra climate, but we also use the GLOW-H2 and the COO data set. We looked primarily at positive temperature deviation and negative precipitation deviation. So again, as a proxy for drought in that case, as well as using the water stress index with the terra climate data. We have models that have also negative temperature deviations and from the mean of each panel, so each municipalities, and positive precipitation deviation. But for the main analysis that we present here, just for the sake of interpretation, we keep this a bit simpler. And we use homicide violence. These are data from National Police Organization that measure the rate of homicide per 1,000 inhabitants in each municipality. And we have this narco trafficking pedigree score that varies between 0 and 4, and 4 being high degree of presence of narco trafficking organization that Nick Magliocca and Jennifer Devine and Beth Tellman have assembled for those two countries. And this pedigree data is based on information about drug seizure, evidence of laundering of money, for instance, using cattle ranching, like landing strip in the middle of jungle. So it's a fairly, based on fairly broad data, but it's kind of different, distinct here from violence. And so again, as Filiz, we use panel fixed effects. We have panel and year fixed effect with error clustered, it's actually by county, but municipality in that sense. Of course, not country. And yeah, we have model for the Jones sample. So the country we model with each country separately. It turns out it matters a lot. And yeah, I'm gonna present some of the results. So the first thing I'd like to show you is a cross-validation results. So that's a very much similar panel that Filiz presented earlier. So we also use tenfold cross. What we wanted to do here is basically assess to what degree different climate data set help explain better migration versus a neural model that just have the fixed effect, but not any variable. And so our setup is a bit different in the sense that we look not at the R square, but the root mean square error, which is kind of similar, equivalent in the same way. But in that case, like negative number means a better score. And we show the mean value with the dots, and the whisker show the 80% confidence interval of 200 replications. And so I think the first element that comes out of the picture is that, yeah, it seems that having those climate variable helps, but it really helps very marginally. The gain is very small. And there's kind of uncertainty as to whether they really help. And so I think that's a warning for, like, I think we need to be a bit cautious about those narrative around climate change driving migration out of Central America. Those variables really explain little in of themselves. And what we end up using is mostly the STERA data. The reason is that it performs actually slightly better on average. And we have data that, from analysis that Rebecca did for us that shows that the climate data collects, especially for temperature, better over Guatemala, for which we had a network of 150 gauges to collect with that. So we end up using this data. But we also have the result, at least for violence and narco trafficking, are kind of similar with the other data set. Let's say. So these are our main results. We're looking just at the joint sample. So look, starting with the first column, that just have the climate variable. We find generally that temperature increase actually decrease migration in both countries. And that we do find some evidence for the same thing with the water stress index, the drought. So the drought actually decreased migration, but it's just ever so slightly significant. Precipitation is not. Now, what's more interesting, I would say, is when we move to this letting those variables interact with violence first in this middle column, is that violence has actually a suppressing effect on migration. So wherever you have more violence in a given municipality, the decrease in migration that is due to this rise in temperature is actually even larger than what it would be. That's very important. That's different from the direct effect of violence. People, of course, violence create migrants. In that case, I think our coefficient, direct effect, the coefficient for direct effects varies between, is always positive, but not always statistically significant just because of the trends in the data. But that's just different. Here, it's just looking at the municipality of higher level of violence. What is compared to municipality with lower level of violence? How does migration response to climate shock vary? And we find a suppressing effect for temperature. And similarly, for narco trafficking activities, we find where there's more narco presence, there's a higher suppressing effect due to temperature on migration. And the same in that case also for the drought indicator. And I think it's a little bit unexpected because those two variables, violence and narco activities, are actually very weakly correlated. The correlation value is 0.17, so 1.7, it's very small. So they really map onto different dynamics in that sense. And so what we did then was to run the same regression, but this time country by country. And there, I think if you look at the left column, actually the result vary a lot. There's significant heterogeneity. So in Guatemala, we find that higher temperature increase migration. And in Honduras, it's the same as the result I show you. So higher temperature means decrease migration. But the suppressing effect I was telling you about earlier of violence and narco activities on migration is mostly driven and observed in Guatemala. In Honduras, we actually don't find any evidence of suppressing effect. And I think it's a bit unclear what's driving that very marked contrast between those two countries. One element is that Honduras had much higher level of violence over a much longer period, and that could have forced people that might have considered leaving already leave in some sense, so that kind of suppressed this effect. It's also true that the level of wealth in Honduras is also much lower, the GDP per capita than Guatemala, and that could be also an element here. And the last thing is, of course, some measure of exposure. So average elevation in Guatemala is actually higher than in Honduras, and that might be also different exposure and different type of crops in both countries that might react differently to this driver. So it was a bit unexpected. That's what are the results. But these results we have for Guatemala about the suppressing effect of violence and narco activities on the relation between temperature and drought and migration it's very robust. It actually, we run a whole different set of robustness model, and we always see this. So it's and also with other climate data sets. So what can we say about those results? And I won't go over this table, just also for the sake of time. I want to reflect a little bit about this suppressing effect due to violence and narco activity. So how can we think about those effects? So I think what we think in the case of violence is actually an immobilization effect. So wherever you have higher violence, these violence are likely to negatively affect the local economy, which means probably households have less resources to support the cost of migration, and therefore when a shock, such as again a climate shock happens, it's even harder to find the resources to migrate. And also higher level of violence could make it much more dangerous to travel along migration routes. That could be one such explanation. For narco activities, it's a bit harder to say just because the indicator is broader, but we think it's probably more of a mooring mechanism rather than a immobilization mechanism. And drug trafficking organization for their activities, either investing the profit of drugs in terms of cattle ranching, or like just the fact that the flow of drugs, it can lead to local economic boom would be an exaggeration, but local economic development, and that might make household more resilient to those climate shock in that sense. Yeah, and so I will conclude on this. So again, just to summarize, so climate variables in general have low predictive power in Central America, and we have very significant heterogeneous migration response to climate shock across the country. And I think if you have any thoughts on this, I'll be welcoming, because it's been really a puzzle for us. We have tried to run regression across multiple age categories. We find the same results in our case. So maybe it's also bias in the data we're using, but it's very puzzling. And we find this suppressing effect of violence and organized crime, I think. And I didn't quite show you the result here, but if you run the same regression for anarcho minors, you do find this basically the same result, except that here violence seems to be more important contributor to suppression and narco trafficking activities. And I leave it there. Thank you.
While I get set up, maybe there's time for one question for Fabian, if anyone has a question for him. Can I do this? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
I think that this research really is an interesting, could be really interesting in some of the conversations happening around climate security, and particularly the more militarized responses to this maybe less nuanced analysis that climate, and especially in fragile or conflict affected settings, can drive more instability or more migration or other sort of, escalated conflict response. And I'm just curious how you understand the role of this research in that conversation, and if you have any analysis on that.
Maybe if you can quickly repeat, because people are online.
Yeah, it's a good thing. So I'll be sure whether I understood your question or not. I think the question is a little bit to what extent our research might be influencing also the response of states with regard to migration, especially the security and border enforcement response. And we actually had discussion on this. Luz, it was, but it's of course we don't so we find the suppressing effect of violence on the response between climate change and migration. And one of our concerns is that people misread this and then make the connection. Actually, violence is decreasing migration, and therefore anyone who is fleeing Honduras and Guatemala is claimed to being fleeing violence, actually lying, and that's certainly not what we want to communicate. And if anything, this coefficient for violence direct effect is positive. It's not always significant, and I think that the trend in decreasing violence makes it really hard to find a direct positive relation, also because migration is cumulative. So once you have initial shock and a lot of people flee violence, then it leads to permanently higher level of migrations. But that's, I think, the framing is very important. And I think, yeah, thank you for bringing that aspect.
So I think we'll go ahead. We zoomed way in on one of our research products, and now we're going to zoom out a little bit. So just hit that back. Thanks. Hopefully people can hear me online. Just flag there's a problem, you can unmute and say something. So this is collaborative. Fabian was part of this as well. David Wrathall, who's online, and Susanna Adamo, who recently left Season, close colleague, was my closest collaborator on this work. on this specific paper. The larger project was part of this Minerva, which, as Fabian mentioned, our funds were cut off. I don't know why this isn't projecting the full screen, so hopefully it won't be a problem. It seems to be cutting the last fund. That's okay. Well, let's see if it ends up being an issue. Broadly speaking, the reason Minerva was interested in this is that, clearly there's an interest in why people are leaving the region. And from a security perspective, how can we address this particular combination of factors in the region? And so we look at things like security, safety, stability, and border security as related. What we're going to talk about a bit here is more about the survey data that we have from the regions. But the whole framing of this work was to look at two regions in parallel, try to do the exact same work. We were about to go to the field, and that was actually when our funding was cut off. But this gives you a map. This was work that Brian Kahn, who's one of David Wrathall's colleagues, did. Just map out where migration is occurring, where tweets of people who left the region, geolocated tweets. These are people who were tweeting in the region and then are now tweeting somewhere else. These are obviously primarily not demographically representative, but it gives you a general idea of where people may have moved from. This is actually beginning to be a problem, so I don't know what to do. You're presenting it from Google Chrome, so can you download it? Maybe we'll just leave it in this window, see if that works. I can make this bigger.
It's in the browser, right, Alex?
It's in the browser, and I don't know why it's in the browser. Is there a way to download it and
That's the download thing there. But from the top, but from the right.
Is that in PowerPoint?
In the black ribbon, the third from the right is the download button.
In some other browser now. Just scroll down. Okay, so we'll get through this technological challenge. So basically, we wanted to find out what migrant motivations were, and we had two strategies. One was to review all the survey data evidence that we had from the two regions, and then to go to the field. And as I said, just as we were about to go to the field, our funding was cut. Actually, the whole program was cut. So just to be in truth, Minerva was cut as a program, which is a shame. We summarize in this paper the literature review on what surveys show about migration motivations. First, I want to just talk a little bit about what's going on climatically in both regions. So temperatures are rising throughout in both regions, but in Central America, it's the midsummer drought that's expanding. You also have these horrific hurricane impacts, Ida and Iota. I think it was 2021 or so that just had massive impacts. And then you have these impacts on staple crops and also on some commercial crops such as coffee. In West Africa, the pattern is rainfall recovery in most of the region since the 1980s. Temperatures are rising up, and you'll see in the map in a moment in the western and southern parts, and crop yields have generally increased. So this is a little contrary to some of the narratives we hear about, declining crop yields. Actually, in this region, crop production has increased, but so has population. And so you'd have to look at the population, the kind of per capita yields as well. So this gives you an idea. In the lower left, you can see some work that Richard Seeger and Jenny Nakamura did on the different drought patterns. And so this is precipitation only, not drought, but basically you can see how precipitation has declined precipitously during the midsummer drought, which is in July. In West Africa, what you see is a pattern where along the coast, there's a general drying during the wet season, but the monsoon season in much of West Africa has seen increases in rainfall, especially in the Sahel. since the 1980s, but temperatures have risen as well, so that could have implications for potential evapotranspiration. Generally speaking, what we see in the literature, and many of you are familiar with this paper by Roman Hoffman from Science Magazine, where you have very conflicting evidence on the degree to which various climate variables actually impact international migration, just looking at international migration. So it's an important research area to kind of establish whether climate is actually affecting international migration. So what does the survey research show? First, let's just peel back the onion a little bit and talk about some of the language. We use the term drivers, but drivers actually can mean different things. And so Van Heer has a very helpful kind of disambiguation, I guess you could call it, where you talk about predisposing drivers, things that might create a context in which migration is more likely, proximate drivers, which are the kind of the more direct things like employment or poverty rates that might affect a person, precipitating drivers, which might be that little thing that flicks someone off, like it's a major hurricane, a major disaster, or that maybe there's some other military conflict or something, narco activity, who knows? And those things just flick people off and kind of get them, they're already on the cliff and, as it were, sitting in a precarity, and then they get flicked off that cliff and they make that decision to go. So it sort of triggers their decision. And then finally, you might have these mediating drivers. I also like, and this is all supposed to be lovely animation, but what you see on the right-hand side is some more recent work by Fresnova Flot, which looks at kind of the more interior experience of migrants. What are they actually experiencing? What is their emotional state? What are their kind of family relations? How are they feeling about the decision to migrate? Are they excited? Are they more fearful and apprehensive? Are they being forced in some way by family members, or is the culture in some way or another kind of forcing them into a position where migration seems like one of the only options to realize their aspirations? So we want to kind of, both in a paper that we're preparing, critique what surveys actually talk about when they talk about drivers and root causes and these sorts of things. We want to actually try as much as possible to bring out some of the emotional, psychological, and religious and cultural factors that may be more difficult to capture than in the surveys. You have examples of work by Richard Black in West Africa and an Italian colleague through the FUME project, where they talk about the contingency, the state in which African youth kind of live in a state of constant contingency. If things don't work out here, I'll go somewhere else. If it doesn't work out there, I'll go somewhere else yet again. And if a pirogue shows up and someone calls me from the city in Dakar and says, hey, there's a pirogue heading up to the Canaries, I'll go on that pirogue because it's an opportunity that I might not get, 6 months from now or whenever. So these are things that are kind of difficult to ascertain through surveys. Again, we miss out on root causes. A lot of the root causes issues are things like the political economy or corruption or repression. Violent conflict may be more obvious in some cases. But in many cases, migrants might take these as a given. They might cite them or they might miss them in some ways. Poverty is an underlying driver, but you don't really ask, migrants aren't asked, what's the power relations? What are your capabilities? The Sen approach, that kind of thing. They're not really aware often of those things, so they may not be able to fully articulate what's going on kind of at the local level that might cause people to have a strong motivation to migrate out of a location. And then we did these, we collected as much survey evidence as we could find. We found 12 surveys in Central America and only 4 surveys in West Africa that had multiple waves or runs. So some of these are continuous, like the 4MI surveys, and others are more one time only. And we basically recategorized the survey results into these 11 categories. And I'll just run through some of the results here. And I'm going to skip this one because that one was, I skipped the slide in the PowerPoint as well. But this here shows you kind of the main reasons that people cite in Central America grouped across surveys. And what Susanna has done here helpfully is actually count the number of observations in thousands on the y-axis on the right-hand side. So you can see which of these questions are actually more frequently responded to by respondents. And obviously, economic reasons are a major driver. But what you find in Central America is that corruption and violence and conflict and insecurity are all like up there around 20% of respondents. There's a pretty high standard deviation, but it is somewhat in contrast to what you see in West Africa. And environmental stressors are at around 10% of respondents. So it's a relatively low fraction. For West Africa, you're missing the yellow bar, which tells you the number of actual migrants who said that response. But what you see is basically, again, economic factors are important, but they're much lower than in Central America. Only 55% of respondents in West Africa said that economics is the main reason, or jobs or pay. Family and societal reasons are much more important. So the sending money home is a really important factor. Family and personal reasons. That family and household context is really vital in parts of West Africa. And then you have a very high also response on violence and conflict. But environmental factors end up only being about 3%. It does matter where you interview migrants. So one of the things I didn't mention was some of these surveys are carried out at the border, like in the US. Some of them are carried out in the US or in Europe. So at the destination area, and then others are carried out at the origin area. And in our paper, we're going to be much more precise about where the surveys are carried out. But what you get out of this is that basically, for the most part, for good reason, people at destination say violence, conflict, and human rights abuses and other things are the main reason they left, because they want to stay on message. If you deviate from that message and say economics or jobs was the main reason I left, you may jeopardize your chance at an asylum claim. So I think that's a very obvious reason why that's different. Issues around violence and insecurity, conflict, and rights and freedom are cited twice as frequently by Central Americans as they are for West Africans. But these traditional factors, such as family and personal reasons, in West Africa are very common as opposed to Central America. This is a nice little framework that David, our sort of approach to like mapping change, and I'm only going to focus on two, but basically if you look at the origin areas, it's all in purple. We're looking at aspirations and capabilities. So the purple areas are in the 1992 state, and now we're looking at 2021, roughly 30 years later. And what are some of the things that have changed? Well, if you look at just climate change, you see number 4, the aspiration is likely to have increased, but the capability is likely to have decreased. This is hypothesized. This is not necessarily what our empirical evidence shows, but it's hypothesized. But if you look at something like social media and tools that allow people to communicate across borders, that's was both low, incited relatively low aspirations because people weren't getting tweets and messages and TikTok videos from the United States or Europe, but they also weren't being assisted along their migratory route by these social media tools and WhatsApp and things like that to actually find their way. So these tools have basically increased both the capability and the aspiration to migrate. Why are environmental stressors less reported? We have a number of hypotheses. One is that these are often distal drivers. So a drought impacts your crop yield, that impacts your livelihood, it impacts your poverty level, but you don't always trace things all the way back to that. The other is that things like corruption and governance may be affecting things like response. You don't have a FEMA, you don't have a disaster management agency in many Central American countries. So that natural disaster occurs, and you attribute the fact that you had to leave because there was nobody to actually bail you out. There's no social safety net, essentially. Extreme events could trigger more migration than an underlying cause or reason for migrating, so it's more of a trigger. These are more given things that people don't really think about necessarily. Or it's simply that in the panoply of factors, environmental factors are generally relatively limited, and that's the evidence that Fabian just presented. These are some earlier Bayesian hierarchical models that Fabian ran without going down to the municipal level, but just by country. What we see in Central America is that apprehensions at the southern border are related to the people coming from Central America. It's related to low levels of democracy and higher levels of violence and homicide rates. But in West Africa, it's more related, again, to lower levels of democracy and actually low levels of homicide or violence. I think that was more like conflict fatalities, right? Not homicides. But the diaspora effects are off the chart. So if you have family in Europe, that's a huge factor. So some conclusions, these are tentative, and I hope I'm not going over time. I apologize, but the survey research can provide important insights, but the choice sets are fundamentally limited. So we know about this. It's not something that we are coming up with new, but it's important to kind of like delve into this. You know, one way of maybe changing some of those questions might be more about what would make life better at home. If you could stay, would you stay? What would be the things that would need to change at home in order for you to stay? Did you manage to actually achieve aspirations that you had when you left, if you're talking to someone at destination? And these were actually questions that we plan to ask in a larger scale online survey, but again, for lack of funding, we're unable to go forward. And then lastly, I think really critically is, what does this all tell us about what we can do to actually affect migration? And is there something that we can pull from these results? If yes, superficially, yes, I would say that yes, if you improve the local economy, you could potentially have the migration levels. So people had more jobs and economic opportunities. But then these larger structural factors are really important to address: governance failures and political economy. And there's just a sense in West Africa, for instance, of, I think, endemic hopelessness about the potential. This is something Carrie touched on, is what is the potential for me to realize my life dreams by sitting in a village somewhere that's isolated, maybe doesn't have good internet, and where the sense of opportunity is missing. These are some macro things that you can pull out through interviews, and I'm not going to go into these here because I'd really like to open this up for a larger conversation. But things like narco and gang violence, I think, are important. They really are drivers. But even though our empirical data suggests maybe they suppress migration, there are things that many migrants have spoken about when they come across the border. Family reasons are also important, and then things like imaginaries in West Africa. This is a term that isn't used a lot in the US, but young people are imagining a brighter future. They're kind of thinking about this great utopian future. And if you've seen the movie Il Capitano or something like that, young guys in Dakar, and they're just imagining this great life they're going to have as rock stars in Europe. And I mean, this seems a little far-fetched, but I think there's that element of like, I could win the lottery and I could really strike it big. And I think we can't discount that as a potential motivator, especially for younger migrants. And these are some verbatims I'll just leave up on the screen of interviews with migrants, and I'll leave them there so that we can actually get into a little discussion. And apologies for some of the technical issues we had, but we'll open it up if there's any questions or comments. I think, fundamental question, maybe I'll ask Carrie and you, Filiz, if there are ways in which you feel that your findings could feed into policy or might actually make a difference for people. And it's probably not just about like, can we keep people in place, but actually like, what could make it, how could people realize migration journeys that are also transformative in some way? And so maybe you could speak to that. And Carrie, I know you thought a lot about these issues. I do have a hand up in the room, but maybe we'll just start there and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Alex. And these presentations are so stimulating. So thank you to all the presenters as well. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this concept of the capability to stay. We talk a lot about the aspiration and capability to migrate, but how to think about the capability to stay, I think, is pretty fundamental to answering the question of what's required for people to feel they have a meaningful choice to stay and could imagine fulfilling their aspirations where they are. And having a lot of my fieldwork grounded in East Africa, I think an important component of that is not placing immobility and mobility as a binary, but really seeing how they can support each other and thinking about rural and urban interconnections will be an important part of that answer. And under what conditions can internal migration substitute for international migration, I think it would be an interesting avenue to explore in the places where I'm working. But I also think the question and the relationship with violence is something that really came out of this panel that I found really interesting and kind of unexpected, the degree to which it also, I remember talking with someone in Ethiopia who works on issues of water, and she said, when there's conflict, we see people moving to flee the conflict and to, escape the direct threat of the conflict. But we see during droughts that people are not moving, that we don't see the same degree of displacement. And of course, this was just an anecdotal comment, but it was quite striking to me because it made me think about, well, what do people expect to gain through their movement? And in a period of drought, one thing that was clear is moving to town, people weren't always certain that they'd be in a better situation, in the worst case, being homeless in the city, than if they stayed and were able to draw on their networks where they were and maintain a sense of dignity or government food aid. So I think these are some of the questions that were coming up for me as I was listening to some of the presentations. And then I think a missing dimension of that hasn't come out in our panel presentations too much is just the role of the labor market in driving migration trends from certain places, and looking at the migration system beyond just these origin countries, but where they're going. I love the way Filiz got into state level effects at destination. I think as we can combine more and more of our understanding around migrant network effects, but also the demand for immigrant workers that still exists and is such a powerful driver of migration, then we can kind of look at those dynamics together with these drivers. So a few scattered thoughts. Filiz, I'm not sure if you would like to address any of those questions.
Did you want to respond, Filiz?
I'll just say one sentence. The interest in heterogeneity is basically trying to understand who is impacted in what way, and that could allow us to better address these things. I have a question for you, but I'll ask it offline.
Daniel, did you still have a question?
Thank you, Alex, and everybody. My name is Daniel Naujoks. I'm a professor here at Columbia, teaching migration and refugee studies. I have a question for you, Alex. So the discussion on drivers and root causes and triggers, right, is very old, and many of us who have done, like, my early research was all qualitative research. Now I'm coming to the dark side more and more. We know that survey questionnaires are highly limited, right? Like, those questions asking somebody, okay, here's a list of 5 reasons why did you migrate? Was it work? Was it violence? Was it climate, right? And then we all know that this is highly problematic. And one thing you mentioned also, the context matters, many things that will not be always apparent in the outcome. So from your research, how does it feed into a broader critique of the survey literature, which then gives us maybe, because we have a huge discourse, right, about why do people migrate? Are they false? Are they economic refugees? Are they, even refugees might say, I want to work, right? I mean, so there's like, so how does it contribute to a broader critique of this survey methodology for finding the drivers or information on the drivers? And the second question, from your planned research and the interviews you were set to do you have already maybe some better questions, like even if just a small thing, like even in survey literature and surveys that could replace some of those more plain questions in the surveys that would give more nuance, and that, again, from a climate perspective, would make it easier to identify where there are climate drivers in the responses?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing, and I think everybody in this room would agree, is not to start with a question around climate, because you're immediately going to, seed the idea that climate's, the desire to please the the interviewer is always very high in some contexts. And so you just start. And so we had actually a really nice survey. I thought that was, David and we had worked on together to basically try to get at more these nuances of what's going on in your home, your family. And it was based on, Jürgen Carling's work. I know that Carrie, you worked with him and other people who really thought hard about how to get beneath at the layers of the onion that I put in that slide. I don't think there's any perfect way, and I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not saying survey research is useless. I was at a session earlier this morning where Forum I was presenting at the Mixed Migration Center. I have great respect for the work they're doing. I think we do need to know some of these, basic rationales and reasons why people are leaving areas, but we have to understand better what kind of context, what kind of answers people are actually potentially likely or able to give under certain circumstances. So that's part of what we want to do with this paper. We're already trying to do too much, but we'd like to, contribute to the broader discussion around what can we and can't we conclude from survey research, and when do verbatims and interviews with migrants in these longer form, like just letting people talk, I went to a MoMA exhibit a few years ago, and there was basically people narrating their journey. And they had like a pen, and they went on these maps, and they were drawing, and it was an artist who basically did this as a video art project. But I found it fascinating because they talked about, some of the stuff that was going on at origin, but these very long, what we call segmented journeys, where they're going from one country to the next, trying to find a safe journey, a safe route to their destination. So that was a good way to close, I think. Thank you, Daniel, for your question. Thank you to all the presenters. I thought this was a very rich session.